Cryptic Radio.
It was a crisp, clear autumn morning in 1975 when the Lutz family moved into their new home on Ocean Avenue. The kind of morning where everything feels possible, and you can almost convince yourself that life is about to be a whole lot better than it's been. But little did they know, the house that looked so perfect from the outside was about to become a nightmare they couldn't escape. George Lutz stood in front of the massive colonial-style house, staring at the red brick facade, the white columns on either side of the porch, and the large windows that gave the house a grand, welcoming look. It was beautiful, and it was theirs. "Can you believe it, Kathy?" "Our dream home," George said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead as he adjusted his jacket. He was a tall guy, in his early 30s, with shaggy brown hair and a tired but excited look in his eyes. Kathy, his wife, grinned and nodded. She was a few years younger than George, with blonde hair that bounced as she walked. "I've been dreaming of a house like this for years," she said, squeezing his arm. Their 3 kids, Daniel, Christopher, and Missy, were already inside, running through the rooms, shouting excitedly about which bedrooms they'd get. It was the start of a new chapter for the Lutz family after a rough few years. Moving to the small town of Amityville felt like a fresh start. No more struggles, no more constant moving. It was supposed to be their escape. But even as they unloaded their boxes, there was something in the air. Something off. George couldn't put his finger on it, but as he set down a box on the front porch, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Must be the wind, he thought. But deep down, a voice inside him whispered, "Don't ignore it." By evening, the house was buzzing with activity. The kids were excited to explore their new home, while Kathy unpacked the kitchen. George took a moment to stand in front of the living room window, staring out at the long driveway that led to the street. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. "George, come help me with this," Kathy called from the kitchen, snapping him out of his thoughts. He took a deep breath, pushed his unease aside, and went to help her. Dinner was nearly ready, and it would be their first night together in the house. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, George couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room, unpacking some final boxes and setting up a cozy spot to watch TV. Kathy was in high spirits, chatting about how they were going to make this place their own. But even as they laughed, the house seemed to grow colder. A draft swept through the room, and the once peaceful quiet was now pierced by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Kathy looked around, noticing it too. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp. "Hear what?" George replied, though his tone didn't quite match his words. He had heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone walking around upstairs. The kids were in bed. No one else was supposed to be in the house. But the sound kept going, coming closer to the stairs. George stood up, his heart racing. "I'll go check it out," he said, more to reassure Kathy than anything. But deep down, he wasn't sure who needed reassurance more, her or him. He walked cautiously up the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath him. The hallway at the top felt longer than it should have. As he reached the first bedroom, the air grew thick, heavy. He opened the door and saw nothing out of the ordinary, but there was something about the room that felt wrong. It was too still, too silent. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. It's just an old house, he thought. Nothing to worry about. But when he returned downstairs, Kathy was pale, looking like she'd seen a ghost. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something about this place. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like we're not alone." That night, as they tried to settle into bed, the house seemed to come alive. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the constant creaks, grew louder. It was like the house was breathing. George lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss the noises as the house settling or the wind pushing against the walls, but something deep inside him told him it was more than that. Something wasn't right here. Kathy, meanwhile, had drifted off to sleep, but George could hear her murmuring in her sleep, her voice soft and strained. He leaned over to check on her, but she seemed fine, her face relaxed in slumber. Still, a feeling gnawed at him. Just then, a loud thud echoed from the attic. George froze. He had checked the attic earlier. It was empty. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic, his breath shallow. When he reached the top, the light flickered, casting strange shadows across the dusty space. And then, nothing. It was empty. Just an old, unused room filled with boxes and forgotten things. But as he stood there, the air thickened again, and he heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, echoing around him. He turned quickly, scanning the shadows. "You're just imagining things," he thought, trying to calm himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't his imagination. He hurried back downstairs, his heart pounding. When he returned to the bedroom, Kathy was awake, sitting up in bed, staring at him. "Did you hear it too?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. George didn't answer. He didn't need to. Whatever was here, it wasn't going anywhere. It had been a few days since they moved in, but George and Kathy both knew something was wrong with the house. They didn't talk about it much, but the air felt thick with unspoken fear. The creaking sounds had become more frequent, like whispers that followed them from room to room. The house had a pulse, an uncomfortable, unnerving pulse. That afternoon, Kathy decided to take the kids to the park. She needed to get away from the house, even if just for a few hours. The fresh air would do them good, she thought. As soon as they pulled away, George sighed with relief. The house was empty, at least for a little while. He didn't realize how much the place was getting to him. He had always prided himself on being the strong, steady one, someone who could protect his family no matter what. But lately, that feeling of security was slipping away, as though something was tugging at him from the inside, pulling him toward something he couldn't see. Later that evening, George stood in front of the bathroom mirror, splashing cold water on his face. He had worked all day, fixing things around the house, trying to ignore the strange feelings that kept creeping up. It was just the stress of the move. That's what he kept telling himself. He stared at his reflection, his face pale, eyes hollow. His tiredness didn't just come from the long hours. It felt deeper, like he was losing something. The reflection in the mirror shifted. At first, George thought it was just his eyes playing tricks. But then he saw it. A shadow, moving behind him, even though no one was in the bathroom. His heart thudded in his chest and he spun around, half expecting to see Kathy or one of the kids. But the room was empty. His hands shook as he wiped his face with a towel, his mind racing. "You're just exhausted." "It's nothing." He repeated over and over, trying to push the panic away. But the unease wouldn't leave him. It lingered, settling into his bones like a weight he couldn't shake off. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, George sat on the couch, staring into the fire. Kathy was in the kitchen, busy with something, but her mind seemed far away, lost in the house's heavy silence. The house was quieter than it had been in days. But then, just as he thought it was safe, he heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A voice. It wasn't Kathy. It wasn't any of the kids. It was a whisper, low and cold, as though it was right behind him. "Get out." He froze, the words cutting through the air like ice. The voice was harsh, filled with a coldness that made his skin prickle. His body tensed, his eyes darting around the room. "Did you hear that?" George asked, his voice shaky. Kathy walked into the living room frowning. "Hear what?" "The voice. It told me to get out," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but it cracked anyway. Kathy shook her head, taking a seat next to him. "George, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe it's just the tension of the move." He looked at her, his eyes wide with panic. "No, Kathy. This place is wrong. Something is in this house, and it's not letting us go." The next morning, the family gathered around the breakfast table. The kids were buzzing with energy, but Kathy couldn't ignore the tension between her and George. Something had shifted between them, something unspoken. They were both on edge. Missy, their youngest, was unusually quiet. She sat at the table, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. "Missy, honey, what's wrong?" Kathy asked, reaching out to touch her daughter's hand. Missy looked up slowly, her big brown eyes wide and serious. "There's a man in my room," she said softly. "He talks to me." Kathy froze, her hand dropping from Missy's. "A man? What do you mean?" "He's tall," Missy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he says things, bad things." George looked at Kathy, his face pale. "What kind of things?" Missy shrugged, clearly uninterested in the conversation. "He just watches me, and then he goes away." Kathy glanced at George, her breath catching in her throat. Missy's words didn't make any sense, but they both knew deep down that the house was not as safe as it had once seemed. As days turned into weeks, the strange events escalated. The house didn't just creak anymore. It groaned. It moaned. The coldness seemed to seep into every corner, and it wasn't just the temperature. It was a chill that settled into their hearts, a feeling that something dark was lurking just out of sight. George had begun to withdraw, his mood darkening with each passing day. He was constantly on edge, his eyes darting around the room, as though expecting something to jump out at him. His energy had been drained, replaced with a quiet anxiety that wouldn't let him go. And Kathy? She had started seeing things. At first it was small stuff, a shadow moving in the corner of her vision, or a shape standing just out of sight. But it got worse. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as if someone was standing over her, watching her. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she saw a figure in the hallway. It was tall, dark, and distorted, like a silhouette without features. Kathy's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, unable to move. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. And just as it reached out toward her, the figure vanished. She ran to George, shaking, her breath coming in short bursts. "George, we have to leave. Something's here. It's not just in our heads." George looked at her. his eyes filled with the same fear that had been growing in him. I know. I feel it too. But leaving wasn't as simple as it seemed. Whatever was in that house wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The days blurred together for the Lutz family. The unsettling presence that had taken root in their home had become undeniable. The creaking floors, the whispers in the dark, the constant cold air. They weren't just figments of stress anymore. Someone was in that house, watching them, waiting for them. One afternoon, Kathy decided to take a long walk to clear her head. She needed to get away from the house, if only for a few hours. As she walked through the neighborhood, her thoughts spiraled. She had tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. Maybe the stress of the move, the kids adjusting, but nothing explained the feeling of being constantly watched. Nothing explained the coldness that seemed to cling to her skin, even in the warmth of the sun. She found herself back in front of the house sooner than she'd intended, unable to resist the pull of it. The house loomed large in front of her, its windows dark and vacant, like eyes watching from behind glass. She hesitated at the front door, almost feeling as though she was walking into a trap. But it was her home. She had to face it. When she stepped inside, the familiar weight of dread settled on her chest. The house was too quiet. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Kathy froze. The kids were at school. George was at work. There was no one here but her. "George?" she called out hesitantly, her voice shaky. But there was no answer. The footsteps continued, coming closer. One step, another. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears. There was no way she was going up there alone. Not after everything that had happened. Yet, as if driven by an invisible force, Kathy found herself climbing the stairs. Her legs moved without her consent, each step heavier than the last. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, the faintest flicker of light coming from the room at the end of the hall. She crept down the hallway, her breath shallow, her skin prickling with cold. When she reached the door, it opened on its own. And there he was, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing in the corner of the room, his back to her. Kathy gasped, taking a step back. Her mind raced. There was no way this could be happening. But before she could move, the figure turned. His face was pale, his eyes dark, empty, hollow eyes. His lips curled into a smile that was anything but friendly. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at her. "George!" Kathy screamed. But the words came out choked, as if the air itself was heavy. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure vanished. Kathy stood frozen in the doorway, the cold sweat dripping down her spine. She didn't know what to do, didn't know who to turn to. She couldn't explain what had just happened. The following evening, after a long, exhausting day, George sat in the living room, trying to unwind. Kathy had locked herself in their bedroom, too shaken to talk about what had happened earlier. She had tried to explain it, but the words wouldn't come out right. How could they? George had been skeptical about the house at first. He had brushed off all the strange occurrences as stress, as his mind playing tricks on him. But now, he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang coming from upstairs. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He had to check it out. He raced up the stairs, his feet pounding the old wood. The noise was coming from Missy's room. When he reached the door, he threw it open, expecting to find his daughter, confused or maybe playing a trick on him. But Missy wasn't there. Instead, the room was freezing, the air thick and heavy. The walls seemed to be closing in around him. There was a faint, almost imperceptible red glow coming from behind the wallpaper, as if someone was hiding beneath it. George's stomach churned. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and tugged at the edges of the wallpaper. The moment he pulled it free, he found himself face to face with an old, rusted door. It was a small door, barely big enough to fit through, hidden behind layers of paper and years of neglect. But it wasn't the door that unsettled him the most. It was the smell. The faint metallic scent that filled the room, like decay. Before he could reach for the handle, he heard Kathy's voice calling from downstairs. "George, get down here now." He hesitated, his mind racing. Something told him to leave the room, to forget the door. But another part of him, the part that was growing more desperate by the day, urged him to open it. He stepped back, shaking his head. He needed to focus. Kathy needed him. But as he left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door was calling to him. That night, the house was alive again. The sounds were louder now, as if the house itself was pressing against them, suffocating them. George and Kathy both lay in bed, wide awake, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. They had tried to sleep, but every time their eyes closed, the dark seemed to close in around them. Suddenly there was a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. But they weren't the same as before. These were heavier, more deliberate, as if something or someone was moving through the house. George got out of bed, his heart racing. "Stay here," he whispered to Kathy. She grabbed his arm, her voice shaking. "No, George, don't go. Please." But he pulled away gently, his gaze fixed on the door. He had to check. He had to know what was happening. He stepped into the hallway, the air colder than before, like a sharp bite against his skin. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the hallway light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and George felt his breath freeze in the air. He turned a corner and froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a shadowy figure. It was tall, much taller than any person he had ever seen. Its shape was vague, its outline shifting like smoke. It moved toward him, gliding through the air, its eyes, empty dark holes, locked onto his. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then the figure raised one hand, and George felt a cold, invisible grip wrap around his throat. He gasped, struggling for air, but the force held him in place. His body went rigid, his vision blurring. In the distance, he heard Kathy's frantic voice calling his name, and then everything went black. Kathy couldn't breathe. The moment George collapsed in the hallway, unconscious, her world spun into chaos. She ran to him, her heart pounding, her mind barely processing the horror of the moment. He was breathing, barely, but the look in his eyes was vacant, lost. Something had taken hold of him, something that wasn't human. "George! George!" Kathy cried, shaking him, desperate to pull him back from wherever he had gone. He didn't respond. His skin was cold, his body unresponsive. Kathy's fear spiked. She had to get him out of this house. She had to save him before it consumed him completely. But how? Behind her, she could hear the low hum of something. Distant, yet growing closer. A voice. A whisper. The same cold voice she had heard before. "Get out. Now." Kathy stood frozen, holding George, her mind racing for answers. What was this place? What had they gotten into? She couldn't explain the supernatural terror that gripped them, but she knew deep in her bones that there was something evil in this house. And it wasn't just in their minds. She dragged George back to the bedroom, her hands shaking as she tried to shake him awake. Her breath was ragged, but there was no answer. "Please, George," she whispered, panic rising. "Please come back to me." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, George's eyes fluttered open. He blinked, dazed, as though trying to adjust to the world around him. "Kathy," he rasped, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. Kathy looked at him, relief flooding through her. "You're okay. You're okay," she repeated, but even she didn't believe the words anymore. Because in her heart she knew they weren't safe. They never had been. In the days that followed, George seemed different. It wasn't just the physical toll the house had taken on him. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. He became withdrawn, like a shell of the man Kathy had married. He'd stare off into space for hours, barely acknowledging her or the kids. Kathy didn't know what to do. She tried everything she could think of to reach him, but it was like talking to a ghost. The spark that had once been in his eyes was gone, replaced by something darker, something that wasn't him. And then there were the nights. The nights were worse. The shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, and the house creaked and groaned as though it were alive and angry. The cold was unbearable. The whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing through the walls. Kathy had started to feel it too, the pull of the house, the draw toward the dark things within it. She knew she was slipping, but she couldn't help it. Every day, she felt herself getting closer to something she couldn't understand, something terrifying. She woke one night to find herself standing in the hallway. She had no idea how she had gotten there, but when she looked around, she knew she wasn't alone. Something was there with her, something watching. Her breath caught in her throat when she turned to face the door at the end of the hallway, the door that had been locked ever since they'd moved in. It was open now, and beyond it, something was calling her. She felt it in her bones. But before she could move, she heard George's voice, quiet but desperate, from behind her. "Don't go there, Kathy, please." She spun around to find him standing in the doorway of their room, his eyes wide with panic. He had heard it too, the pull, the call. "George?" Kathy whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to us?" "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I think it wants us." It was Father Mancuso, a local priest, who first told them the truth. The Lutz family had tried to ignore the mounting evidence of the house's dark power, but it was clear they couldn't escape it. George and Kathy reached out to the church, desperate for help, even though part of them feared what they might hear. Father Mancuso had been to the house once before, years ago, during the DeFeo tragedy. He was the one who had performed the last rites for the family that had been killed there. He didn't want to return, but he did. He couldn't turn his back on the Lutz family, even if it meant facing the horrors he'd seen before. When he arrived at the house, Father Mancuso was visibly shaken. The moment he stepped through the door, he recoiled. "It's here," he whispered, almost to himself. "I felt it the moment I crossed the threshold." The priest turned to George and Kathy, his face pale. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "This house, this place, it's not just haunted. It's a place of pure evil.
It was built on the blood of the DeFeo family and the evil that was created there. It's powerful. It's not just waiting for you to leave. It's waiting for you to surrender. George looked at Kathy, his eyes filled with fear. But we can't leave. We're trapped. It won't let us go. Father Mancuso nodded grimly. Then it's already too late.
Kathy and George had no choice. They had to leave, even if it meant abandoning everything they had worked for. The house was trying to break them, to destroy them, and they couldn't fight it anymore. The darkness had seeped into their souls, and now it was threatening to consume everything. But as they packed up their things, it wasn't the house they were running from. It was the evil that had taken root inside them. As they drove away, they could still hear the whispers, still feel the cold, even with the house far behind them. And George knew that it wasn't over. Not really. They had escaped, for now. But the house would always be with them, and it would wait. It had been weeks since they left the house, but the horror of the past still clung to George and Kathy like a shadow. They tried to go back to normal, tried to pretend that the house wasn't a part of their lives anymore, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't shake the feeling that the house hadn't let them go. It had followed them. Kathy hadn't been able to sleep without the light on for days. She could still hear the whispers, low, menacing murmurs that filled her mind in the dead of night. Sometimes she'd wake in the dark, heart racing, as if someone was standing over her, watching her. George, on the other hand, had become a shell of the man he once was. He tried to be strong, to help Kathy, but he could feel the house's presence inside of him. The darkness was still there, gnawing at him, clouding his thoughts. It was like it had left an indelible mark on him, one that wouldn't wash away. They sought help, turning to therapists, counselors, even religious figures. But none of it worked. The nightmare wasn't just something that had happened. It was something that had embedded itself in their very beings. They were marked, and that realization terrified them. One evening, when the family was gathered in their new home, trying to settle in, the phone rang. Kathy picked it up, her hand trembling as she greeted the voice on the other end. It was Father Mancuso. "I've been trying to reach you," he said, his voice grim. "It's not over. The house. It's still active. There's been a series of strange occurrences in the neighborhood. It's as if the house is trying to pull people back in. The darkness. It's not done with you." Kathy felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "We left. We're safe now." Father Mancuso sighed, the weight of his words evident in his voice. "You may have left the house, but the evil that was born there, it doesn't just vanish. It follows. It finds you. The house is still reaching out. It's still connected to you. You have to stop running." Kathy swallowed, her eyes darting to George, who was sitting across the room, his face pale. He had heard every word. He knew what the priest was implying. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was them. The darkness hadn't been left behind. It had followed them, and now it was growing stronger. Despite the priest's warning, Kathy and George tried to continue with their lives. They moved, they worked, they tried to focus on their family. But every night, the terror returned. Missy, their daughter, had started talking about things that she couldn't possibly know. She described things that happened in the house, things she couldn't have witnessed, considering she had been so young. She spoke of the figure in the corner, the smell of rot that permeated the air, the cold that froze her bones. And then came the night that they could no longer deny the truth. George had fallen asleep in the living room, exhausted from work. Kathy woke suddenly, her body drenched in sweat. She looked across the room, and her heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was the same figure she had seen all those weeks ago, the shadowy man with empty eyes and a grotesque smile. But this time, it wasn't a hallucination. This time, it was real. Kathy's scream tore through the house. She rushed to George, shaking him awake, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "George! George, wake up!" she cried, but her voice was choked with terror. George opened his eyes and froze. He saw it too. The figure didn't belong in their home. It wasn't part of the world they had fought so hard to create. And that's when they understood. They hadn't escaped. The house had never really let them go. Kathy and George knew they couldn't keep running. The house had followed them, and now it was time to face the truth. The evil that had thrived within those walls had found a new place to manifest, and it was going to destroy them if they didn't fight back. With Father Mancuso's help, they began the ritual to confront the darkness once and for all. They performed a cleansing ceremony, invoking prayers and symbols of protection, but the entity within the house resisted. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the darkness itself was fighting back, refusing to relinquish its hold. The lights flickered, shadows danced around them, and an unbearable pressure built in the room. For a moment, Kathy thought it might crush them. But then, something strange happened. The pressure lifted. The room grew silent. The figure in the doorway faded away, and the whispers died down. The house, it seemed, had quieted. The evil was no longer pressing in on them. It was gone. Or was it? The days following the cleansing were peaceful. Eerily so. Kathy and George cautiously allowed themselves to believe that they had finally rid themselves of the malevolent force that had plagued them for so long. They packed their belongings and left their home, not knowing whether they had truly won or if the house was simply biding its time. They never returned. They never spoke about the house again. They tried to rebuild their lives, but the trauma of their experiences lingered. Even after all these years, the memories of that house haunted them, like a distant scream in the back of their minds. They had left the house behind, but the evil had left its mark, and it would never be truly gone. The days had turned into weeks, and the weight of the past still hung over George and Kathy like a dark cloud. They had done everything they could to forget, to move on, but something about the house, something about the evil it harbored, refused to let them go. It had been nearly a year since they'd left the house. George had changed, physically and mentally. He had aged years in a matter of months, his face hollowed with the strain of the experiences that had nearly destroyed him. Kathy, too, had withered under the stress, though she tried to put on a brave face for the children. But both of them knew, deep down, that they had never truly escaped. It was the night before the anniversary of their departure that everything began to unravel again. Kathy sat alone in the living room, a book resting forgotten in her lap. She stared at the dark window, feeling the familiar chill creep into the room. The house was far away, but she could still feel it, that presence, the weight of the darkness. A knock at the door. Kathy jumped, heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't expected anyone. Slowly, she stood,
hesitated, and then made her way to the door. When she opened it, she was met with a strange sight. Father Mancuso. The priest's face was pale, his eyes wide with concern. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly, "but we need to talk." Kathy stepped aside, letting him in. The moment he crossed the threshold, Kathy felt it. The air grew colder, the atmosphere thickening around them. "Father, what's going on?" Kathy asked, her voice trembling. Father Mancuso closed the door behind him, his face grim. "I've been to the house," he said, and his words struck Kathy like a blow. "What do you mean you've been to the house? You can't go back there, it's..." She stopped herself. Her mind was racing. "It's gone. It's over. It has to be." "I thought it was," the priest murmured. "But the evil, it's never truly gone. I felt it again. It's still there, Kathy. And I believe it's reaching out to you. It wants you back." Kathy's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. Not again. Not after everything they'd been through. "Father, please," she whispered. "Please tell me you're wrong." The priest hesitated, looking away. His eyes clouded with something dark. "I wish I could, but it's calling you, Kathy. It's calling all of you. And if we don't do something, it will never let you go." Kathy and George listened in silence as Father Mancuso spoke, his voice filled with an urgent conviction. They had to return to the house to face the evil once and for all. The priest explained that, over the years, people had tried to purge the house of its malevolent force, but it always found a way to come back. It was as if the house itself had a soul, a presence that thrived on fear, on pain, on suffering. George and Kathy had hoped that the house would eventually fade into nothingness. But deep down, they both knew it would never be that simple. The house had taken something from them, and it wouldn't let go until it had taken everything. "We have to end this," Father Mancuso insisted. "It's the only way." They didn't want to go back. Every instinct told them to stay far away. But Kathy knew that they had no choice. They couldn't live in fear forever. The next morning, they set out toward the house. It was just as they remembered it, quiet, ominous, and still standing tall, as if it had waited for them to return. As they approached the front door, George felt the weight of the air pressing down on him. The house loomed before them like a living creature, breathing and waiting. Father Mancuso stepped forward, holding a cross in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. "This time we finish it." The door creaked open. Inside, the house was suffocatingly cold. It felt wrong, like the walls themselves were alive. Shadows moved where there should be none. The air was thick with an unseen presence, making it hard to breathe. Kathy and George exchanged a look. They were both terrified, but they knew they had to face the truth. This wasn't just a haunted house. This was something older, something far more sinister. Father Mancuso began the prayers, his voice low but steady. The walls groaned in response. The temperature dropped even further, until it felt like they were standing in a tomb. And then it happened. The floor trembled. A loud, guttural roar echoed through the house, shaking the very foundations. The walls twisted, and from the darkness a figure appeared, one that Kathy recognized all too well. The man. The figure that had haunted them from the very beginning. It wasn't just a ghost. It was the manifestation of the evil itself. The figure lunged at them, but Father Mancuso stood firm, holding the cross high. He chanted louder, his voice shaking with both fear and faith. The house screamed as if it were alive, as if it were fighting for its own survival. The shadows swirled violently around them, closing in like a storm. George stepped forward, taking Kathy's hand, and together they walked toward the center of the room. "We're not afraid anymore," George whispered, his voice unwavering. In that moment, everything seemed to still. The darkness seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension. Father Mancuso's voice rose in a final chant, and with a violent flash of light, the figure screamed, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The house shook one final time, and then silence. The evil was gone. They left the house for the last time. There were no more whispers, no more shadows. The terror that had haunted them for so long had finally been vanquished. As they drove away, Kathy glanced back one last time. The house stood silent, as if it were waiting for something that would never come. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The Lutz family had survived. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side. But Kathy knew that they would never forget what they had been through. The memories of the Amityville house would stay with them forever, a haunting reminder of the evil that had once lived there. But now, at least, they were free.